So without further ado, Michael Decter.
Thank you, Anton. When I arrived this morning, they didn't have a name tag for me, but apparently I didn't need one because they decided to go with the big lettering. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Anton was on me very quickly after a couple of pieces in the Star, that I wrote, one on Orange and one on the Drummond report, and it was a sort of flippant comment on my part that I would come and speak about Drummond through an orange lens. I have to tell you, that seemed like a really good idea in that moment, and then as time wore on and I had to actually prepare something, it seemed like a more and more difficult and, to tell you the truth, dismal idea, given the litigation and other things that may flow from Orange. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands from anyone from Fascino Martin here, but I had thought I would simply read all of the headlines on the articles about Orange and leave it at that. But as I assembled them, I got more and more depressed. There's a tendency, and Graham Scott's here and would probably, although it's been many years, still have a bit of this phenomena that when you get up in the morning, you read the Star, for one horrible moment, you imagine you're still the Deputy Minister of Health, and it's your fault. And Francis Lankin is here, and so the second thought you have is at 8 o'clock, I've got to explain this to the minister, which when it's above the fold in the Star is usually not a really happy experience. So I'm not going to read you all the headlines. I printed them out. It turns out, discovery for me, that you can get the first month going back free, and then after that you got to pay the Star. Well, I wasn't prepared to pay the Star for all the stories. It occupies 16 full pages, just the list of the headlines. So, and it all started on December 5th. And oddly enough, and it's one of these sort of strange coincidences, some of you may recognize this. This is the actual Orange brochure, World Leaders in Transport Medicine. And I have it because 1 week before the 5th, Dr. Chris Mazza came to see me. I now spend some of my time on Bay Street running an investment business. Well, for those of you who are clients in the room, a lot of my time, but almost all my time. It goes better if I'm not there all the time, but he came in raising money, and my interest in meeting him was that I sit on the board of something called Medivie EMS. George McClellan, who very ably runs Medivie EMS, is here. And it's part of Medivie Blue Cross, and it runs the air and land ambulances in Atlantic Canada, and it actually runs land ambulances in Muskoka and Chatham in Ontario. So I was curious about what Orange was doing, and Dr. Mazza was just back from Saudi Arabia and Brazil and was in what I could only describe as a very expansive mood. And the more expansive he got, the more I started to revert to my old deputy minister hat and started to worry about various things that seemed to be kind of not exactly the way one would want them in accountability terms. Anyway, a week later, it was on the front page of the Star, and I still have the phone message from the banker saying, we're going to postpone this raise for a little while, which probably rank as the understatement of the year. What I will say about Orange, because it does segue to one of the main points in Drummond, is that it clearly represents a colossal failure of governance on one hand and accountability on the other. The fact that the minister has said publicly that she was lied to, that she's shocked and appalled, and she has, in fairly rapid order, dismissed the board, the management, and has, in addition to the forensic auditors, I don't know if one should be delighted or depressed that we actually have 23 forensic auditors in the government of Ontario. Maybe we need more, but that's not a really happy. My memory of being a partner at KPMG is I don't think we had 23 forensic auditors, and we were auditors. But she sent them in, and then following that, the OPP have been dispatched to review it. So it certainly hasn't been a happy experience, and yet it started with great hope. And if one reads the materials, this was a new model and a way to go forward and to leverage Ontario's expertise and bring together public expertise, public intellectual property with private enterprise. That is a very difficult combination, and I was taken that was actually a formal part of the Drummond mandate, was to look for opportunities to do this, and his report is completely silent about it in the health field. So I have a feeling some chunk of material probably hit the cutting room floor after December 5th. So what can you say about Orange? Well, it doesn't appear that anybody behaved terribly well, and it certainly appears that the province let Orange slip out from under the accountability framework that it imposes on virtually every other entity in the health sector. I guess we'll know more when Jim McCarter reports, and we'll know more when the OPP finish their work. In my view, it couldn't have come at a worse time for the sector, because the sector, and many of you are leaders in the sector, so you would know this. The sector, in my experience, at times pulls together for the common good, particularly in tough times. Not easily, not readily, and not without a lot of historic baggage, but does pull together. And then at other times it's quite adversarial. Groups blame other groups or compete with other groups. And getting any change made requires getting some moral authority that we really have to do things together. The problem with Orange is everyone in this room and everybody out there in the health sector is going to say that $25 million of missing money, that's the money I needed to run my program that you're now not giving me. And it really, in my view, undercuts the credibility of not just the minister, but the government at a really bad time. And we are heading into difficult economic times. We clearly decided as a matter of maybe Kim Campbell was right that elections aren't the time to discuss serious issues, but you may remember during the election, David Dodge, former governor of the Bank of Canada, not a man given to colorful language. Governors of the Bank of Canada tread very, very carefully. But I was on the wonderful public affairs show, The Agenda, and Dr. Dodge was one of the other participants. And he said the political parties are lying to the people of Ontario about the deficit, which was extremely strong language for him. But all of the parties essentially ran on the 2011 budget. And what happened from the 2011 budget to the election was things got worse. Now, they seem to be getting a little better now, but we went through the whole European situation, the US debt ceiling debacle, and everybody else in the world trimmed their growth forecasts, but the government of Ontario, basically facing an election, didn't. And the opposition parties, for whatever set of reasons, really didn't focus on that issue. So we ended up having an election that was not only a kind of minority outcome, but no one really occupied the ground of saying we have to reconcile our means with what we want to do. I think Drummond was originally intended not as a major thing. It was intended, I'm told by some people, as a quote-unquote fig leaf to get the government through the election. But finance gave him $10 million, and Don Drummond is a very thoughtful and serious, not only economist, but public servant who many people may not know was really one of the architects behind the Paul Martin budgets in the 90s that put the federal fiscal house in order, although in the course of doing that inflicted a good deal of pain on provincial governments. But Don is about as good an economist as you're going to find. And that probably means that the reason I have trouble getting through his report is they do call economics the dismal science. I'm an economist, and it doesn't exactly leap off the page. So let me turn from Orange, which I think at the end of the day, the lessons that I think we could take from Orange are, one, you better listen to people who are concerned in the front lines. I know a lot of people in management think, well, the people in the trenches are always kind of whining. They're always complaining. And that's true. There isn't anybody that works in the front line in healthcare who doesn't think with a little more money, with a little more staff, they couldn't do more. So it's inherent in their belief structure. But once in a while, the red flags are redder than that. And in the case of Orange, not to mix my colors, there were some pretty big red flags raised that were not paid attention to. I think the lesson I would take is you're far better to investigate complaints at the time than try and explain why you didn't 2 years later. The second lesson I'd take is I think we've got the public sector salary disclosure list offside in two ways. The threshold's too low. I really don't need to read a list of every hydro linesman makes over $100,000 or every employee of a hospital that makes over $100,000. I mean, intriguingly, I'd said in the Star article we should raise it to $200,000 because I think the intent was to focus on managers and leaders. But now that this 1%, 99% has been so current, if we set it, intriguingly, in Ontario at the break on the 1%, it would be at $174,000. I also think the list needs to be expanded to catch organizations like Orange, all parts of it, that are essentially part of an arm's length outsource from government. And there are some exclusions now that I don't think make sense. So one of the exclusions that, in my view, doesn't make sense is the exclusion of physicians from the list. I think it's very hard to have an informed discussion if the physicians who are salaried at hospitals are on the list and the physicians that are in community practice are not in the list. I know quickly the physicians will react by saying, well, that isn't our income, it's our billings. A number of other provinces have historically managed that with explanatory notes. But I think if we're going to talk about the whole healthcare envelope, then we really should put everybody on the list. Those things I think would help. Nothing will prevent a group of people who are deliberately dishonest from doing things in healthcare, but the Orange things seem to have gone on for an awfully long time without the kind of scrutiny that it required. Let me turn to Drummond. The thing that's hardest in a couple of reads of Drummond to get at is actually the arithmetic on the numbers. And it took me a while to get my head around it, but I've got it down to a relatively simple formulation, which is always something good. So if I had to explain this to people who don't follow the healthcare sector, what Drummond says is we're experiencing 2% growth going forward, not the 3% we were hoping for in the economy. And therefore, instead of the deficit, which is currently about $16 billion, which roughly means of every dollar that the healthcare gets, 16 cents or so is borrowed money, so about that, that instead of going down to zero, which frankly all of the parties sort of bought into, they had different ideas about how you should do that, but over 4 years, which the Premier is still saying is the government's direction. What Drummond says is it's going to go up on the current trajectory from 16 billion to 30 billion. And therefore, to get to even, you need to spend 7 years of restraint. So we've had the 7 fat years, if you like. We're going to have the 7 lean years. You've got to grow government expenditures at 0.8% a year and health expenditures at 0.25%. Now, I won't go on with the numbers too much longer, but the 2.5% in health compares to 7.4% over the last 7 years per year. So essentially he's saying grow health at 1/3 of the rate you were growing it. So let me put it in dollar terms to make it really plain. We've got a $40 billion health budget. If you continue to grow that health budget at the rate it's grown during the term of office of the current government, the last 7 years, it would grow by $3 billion a year. So that's you're 7% on 40, or 7+%. And Drummond is saying you can only grow at 2.5%, which would be $1 billion. So the gap is essentially $2 billion a year between what we've been doing and what he says we have to do. So the rest of his report is about where would you find $2 billion in the health system. Now we all know that the biggest item in the health system is what the 350,000 people who work in healthcare in this province, maybe it's 400,000 now, get paid. So you're not going to get there without finding a way to lower the rate of growth or come close to eliminating the rate of growth in pay in the sector. Now, Graham Scott, who's leading the negotiations for the government with the doctors this time round, a task I wish him well in. We were chatting earlier, and I said, I'm just going to say to the crowd, you can find the whole $2 billion with the doctors. We'll offer them more money. They'll feel so guilty. They'll give back $2 billion a year, what they're already getting. And he didn't think they'd do that. But the reality is that even 0% settlements don't result in 0% costs. In the case of the physicians, a 0% 3-year settlement on the fee schedule still leaves volume increases, and it leaves shifts within the schedule. So some people think, and these are leaders within the physician community, that you could still see a 5 to 10% rise in physician costs, even with a freeze in the schedule, which makes Graham's task monumental. It's also true, although less true, in the case of other bargaining agents, where there's movement in grid and changes in benefit costs, that 0 is not 0. So it would be nice to say, if everyone just took a 0 for 3 years, we would solve half the problem. You'd save roughly $1 billion of the $2 billion that Drummond says we need to save. But it's tougher than that, and it's going to be very hard, in my view, to explain to the public that 0 is not tough enough. Mr. Lankin and I had the experience of the social contract, where we had to try and explain that -5 was a really good deal, and that didn't go down as well as we'd hoped. It's the case, I think, that no government wants to repeat the efforts of a previous government, a previous recession, because no matter how the reality of those things were, they have a kind of political history to them. So I don't think this government is going to go anywhere near mandatory wage restraints, which means I believe they will have trouble getting $1 billion out of the kind of wage package. So what else does Drummond say that's useful in this regard? If I were to characterize what Drummond says in the well over 100 recommendations he makes, he's gone through every report that's been done in the last 10 or 15 years, and he's pulled out a lot of stuff. Now people say, well, it's all old. There's nothing new in Drummond. Well, of course there isn't anything new in Drummond for 2 very good reasons. One is, it would be hard to find anything new given how many reports have been done. But pretty much everything's been said. You know, and the second part of it is, a lot of it's really good advice. And the main reason we didn't take most of it was we didn't have to. We don't make tough changes in healthcare in good times. We incent some things, we create family health teams, we invest in e-health, we do all sorts of things, but we do them out of a kind of vision of where things are going. We don't do them in the sense of we're going to invest in A instead of B. So we keep investing in the existing system, and then we do the add-ons around the edges. There has been some progress, I'd have to say, and there's someone in the room, I won't name him, who described it to me this way in terms of the LIN's impact in consolidating services, which was to say, in this particular LIN, they've been able to get 2 centers of excellence in cataract surgery, but they haven't been able to close the door on all the other places that aren't very good that are still doing a bit of it. So I would say the LINs, when they've worked well, have been able to consolidate services, but they haven't been able to close the door where you've got inefficient or poor quality services because they haven't had a big enough stick. So one of the things that Drummond clearly says is give the LHINs a bigger stick. I mean, he leaves the minister lots of maneuvering room in terms of regional authority, language, and various ways. But I think it would be fair to say if somebody doesn't have the ability to rationalize services, you're not going to see any savings. Now, how much could you save out of that? It's not billions of dollars in the short term. If we got on a productivity curve where we could find 2 or 3% a year, which many large organizations find, that would certainly be a contribution. And it needs to happen, but it needs to come up against a savings objective, not just wouldn't it be nice objective. The other thing that he does talk about, and I'll come to it, is he talks about the integration of care, which is great because we've talked about the integration of care. We just haven't been able to achieve it, particularly for the people who are the highest users of the health system. We've done a lot, actually, to integrate care on the low-end users, the people that go to the hospital, have a specific procedure, and go home. We do not a bad job of managing their home care. The CCACs are very good at case managing. But the people who fall through the cracks, who cost the system a vast amount of money and suffer themselves a great deal of misery, fall in a couple of categories. The mentally ill, who cycle around between emergency rooms, homeless on the street, and prison. And what we often do is, in the health system, is we clean them up and medicate them enough to get them convicted and put in prison. So I'm quite serious about that. I think it's one of the more shocking things we actually do. And we do it because, I don't know, we've always done that. We've always said, well, if we just put a suit on this guy and, shave him, give him a haircut, he can go to court, be convicted, throw him in jail where he get very, very little treatment for mental illness, and where, I don't know, the estimates run from 20 to 40% of people in prison. So that's our other health system, which is pretty grim. The other group that don't get dealt with very well are people with chronic disease. And this is our bigger challenge. We have the problem we wanted. What do I mean by that? We wanted to live longer, and we are living longer. Average life expectancy, if I'd been here, wouldn't have been in this gorgeous room, but next to St. Michael's Hospital in the 1920s, would have been 55 years of age. If I'd been back in the 1950s, would have been 65 years of age. Now it's 80 years and still rising, despite our best efforts in healthcare. We're living longer. And the result of that, though, is we're not living longer in perfect health. The incidence of chronic disease in the population above 65 roughly doubles. So the big chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, arthritis, go down the list, are becoming a huge burden. And they have one shared characteristic, which is they're not terribly well managed in the acute care system. So putting someone through the emergency room into a hospital bed because they've got unmanaged diabetes is in some cases the only alternative we have, but it's both a very expensive and a not very satisfying alternative for the patient. So amidst all this change and the need to squeeze money out of the system, we need to actually shift resources to look after people with chronic diseases at home and in the community. Now, here's the good news on this. When Kaiser Permanente in California, which is the only health system in North America that's roughly the same size as Ontario, they look after, I think, 9 or 11 million lives, as they would describe it. When they put a real emphasis on chronic care and self-management and proper communication with patients and access to a team of providers, their thinking was they would see results over a number of years, that it was short-term investment for long-term savings. That's not what happened. What happened is the rate of heart attack, the rate of amputation, all of the dire consequences of unmanaged chronic disease fell off very rapidly within months, which shocked the hell out of them. To be kind, the head of chronic disease there said, we were just stunned. We had no idea that making those interventions would result in an immediate drop. And you know, I have to say, and I supported it at the time, and, you know, building a diabetes registry, building huge databases, it's one way to get there, but it's a slow way to get there. We have to have a fairly frank conversation, I believe, with healthcare professions about what constitutes a standard of care. You know, why don't we just say the standard of care for diabetes is that you do these tests, you do them on this frequency, and put an ad in the paper and just say, if you're a diabetic, if you're one of the 900,000 people with diabetes in this province, you should take this page out of the paper. The next time you see your doctor, just make sure all of these things are being done. It is actually that simple. And if you're a doctor who doesn't really want to deal with diabetics, that's fine. There are other doctors within family health teams and within the community who actually have a specialty in that. So I think we've got to have a much more direct conversation, because the way we're trying to do it is kind of round the back end. We're not doing a lot on patient portals or patient communication. We're building databases so we can send reports to the 9,000 doctors that treat the 900,000 diabetics in Ontario, saying you haven't done this test at the right interval, or you've missed this or missed that. That's not a bad thing. But why don't we arm the patient? Why don't we give the patient information, more information, so they can help self-manage the disease they have, and so they can ask for the right things in the healthcare system? And this doesn't all have to be the doctor's office. There's lots of ways to do clinics, to move these things out of the hospital system. Ron Kazarowski's here at the Kensington Clinic, which arose out of the ashes of Doctors Hospital, is a wonderful model. And for all those who every time they hear clinic think privatization, Kensington is a not-for-profit organization that does a superb job on cataracts, does a superb job on colon cancer screening, and does it on an ambulatory basis. One of the things Drummond does point out is that we're still doing way more things in hospitals than need to be done in hospitals. And that was the sort of second piece. If you look back at the 90s, what we did was we moved 80% of surgery to day surgery. We saved a huge number of hospital beds doing that. But then we left almost all of that day surgery within the hospital setting for a whole variety of reasons. And I think we need to revisit that and set up centers of excellence to do things on an ambulatory basis. We may have to be clever about moving staff from the hospitals to these clinics. Some of them may be on the campus of hospitals, so there's backup. But we do need to take seriously that we don't need a 24-hour, 7-day plant to do things that are 10-minute or 20-minute or half-hour procedures that people just want to have and then go home. And we don't need to expose those patients to the risks of the hospitals, which are not, you know, which are considerable of catching something else or whatever else. So I think that's a very important thrust. Is there money in it? Yes, there is. How much? Hard to know. But it could help relieve the pressures on the hospital system. The other piece of this that's important is, and tough, is who does what in healthcare. Virtually every group does work that a lesser trained group could do. So the doctors do a lot of stuff that nurses could do or nurse practitioners could do. I'm looking at Linda Rabinek as I say this, and she, when I chaired the Cancer Quality Council, led an endeavor on nurse-led sigmoidoscopy, which the most stunning moment for me was when Linda came back from meeting all the colleges and said there's no issue with the colleges. There's this idea that you can't do any of this movement of procedures and activities from one group to another is always bound up with the colleges. And yet often it's just about organizing care so there's a proper handoff. So if somebody's doing it and something goes wrong, you know, if midwives are doing a birth and something goes wrong, there's an easy ability to move to a setting where a C-section can be done, so that you know, in the very, very small number of cases where that's necessary. So it's more about organization than about regulation, but it scares people, and it leads to conflict. And every group worries, we'd like to do that stuff that's within our scope of practice, but we don't want to give up this other stuff It's within somebody else's scope of practice. Well, there's going to need to be a table where there's some give and take on that. And let me give a good example. And George McClellan is here from Medivie EMS. While Orange was being pillared in the paper, I'm proud to report as a board member of Medivie EMS, we were being awarded, no thanks to me, but thanks to George and his team, a gold medal by the Institute of Public Administration of Canada for innovative work. The innovative work is about using paramedics. When you think about paramedics on ambulances, you think of them as largely stabilizing a patient and transporting them to a hospital. That's not the way George McClellan thinks about advanced paramedics. Every time I say I'm on the board of an ambulance service, he gets mad at me. He says, we're an out-of-hospital healthcare service. And he's made those words real in Atlantic Canada, first of all by taking over the St. John's ambulance training, because he didn't think that he was getting paramedics trained to a sufficient level. So took it over, advanced paramedic training. Our paramedics don't always transport. They're hooked up electronically so a patient's vital signs can be read at a hospital hundreds of miles away, and a cardiologist say that isn't a heart attack. And they can stay with a patient, stabilize them, and not bring them in and dump them in an emergency room. Second, they are now staffing emergency rooms in small hospitals where there aren't doctors available. So the paramedics are actually the frontline people dealing with and then transporting if they need to. They're also doing home care visits and looking after people. So they've become, you know, a resource in the healthcare system that's doing a widely, you know, a broader scope of things than simply putting someone in an ambulance and driving like hell to the nearest emergency room. And we've got to think about all the healthcare workers out there that could be doing something more than aiming someone at a hospital. Because despite all the incentive pay, I sat on the committee, and Graham now chairs on the wait times data. So every month you'd see the data. And we've made some progress in shortening emergency room waits. But there's still way too many people ending up in emergency rooms who should be looked after elsewhere. And once they're in the emergency room, it's very hard to do something, because you're, as the emergency room staff, you have to prioritize on severity. So the person who shouldn't be there is inevitably going to be bumped back, and eventually they may leave, and they won't feel very good about their experience. So, you know, even before you get to the ALC patients in the hospital who shouldn't be there, you've still got the front door open in a way that it doesn't need to be. So I'm hopeful that some of what, and Drummond refers to it as the Nova Scotia model, and it is in fact the Nova Scotia model, but it's a partnership between the Nova Scotia Department of Health, Medivie EMS. Drummond points to it as a model. It's really worth a look for Ontario. I want to come laterally to the governance question. Charles de Gaulle once said that a nation with 550 cheeses is ungovernable, meaning France, which is a nice way of putting it. Drummond points out that we have 2,500 governances in health in Ontario. Now, they're not all smelly like cheese, although occasionally one gets there. It's simply too many governances. I mean, no wonder things get overlooked. That is an oversight task that even the Ministry of Health has some trouble getting its arms around. And we have built parallel structures. So we've got, and he points this out, overlapping LHINs, community care access centers, public health units. There's a lot of stuff that needs to come together, not just for efficiency, but to actually have enough clout to begin to integrate services across the continuum. Ontario took a kind of pass on the early rounds of regionalization, and I understand that. Hospitals in Ontario are very, very proud of their heritage, and it just about finished off Duncan Sinclair and the Commission just to come down from 220 to 160 or whatever we currently have. There have been some voluntary mergers. I think we could in some areas move to broader health systems, but we're not going to do that without putting together some of these governances that are there and are marginally competitive with each other. They're not always competitive. Some areas they get along really well. But there's just too much stuff out there, I think, to get the kind of efficiencies and alignment that we need. And he also says what would have been seen a number of years ago as a dangerously radical thing, but it's also a true thing, which is the doctors have to come into the tent. Now, he tiptoes gently on it. He says the FITs, because they're organized, the family health teams could come into this thing more readily and become the core of primary care, which would be a good thing. And he advocates for OMA playing a role, an advisory role at a regional level, which would be a good thing because you can't run a close to the coalface efficient health system if you negotiate with one of the key players who account for 25% of the revenue at a great distance from what's going on at the coalface. And that is going to be, I think, a very central issue in this round. We are one of the few remaining jurisdictions in the world that hasn't found a way of bringing general practitioners, primary care physicians into the system. I mean, the Brits started it in the 1940s by going to group practice. And many, many other nations have found a variety of ways of going in. And this, to me, it's not only important because you need a base to go to multi-provider primary care, but it's also important because the young graduates in medicine don't want to own a practice for their whole lives. They're working locums. They're doing everything that you could imagine to avoid what an earlier generation simply wanted to do, which was go out, build a practice, and look after those people for as long as they could. There has been a generational change, and if we don't change the model, we're going to have a very hard time meeting the needs of people with a system that doesn't have the support, doesn't have the kinds of partnerships that need to be built. So I do want to leave some time for questions. I tried a few times to go through and categorize all the Drummond recommendations, and it just overwhelmed me because there's a lot of stuff there. But it does fall in categories, some big categories that I think are important. Consolidating the governances, getting robust primary care and getting it focused on chronic care, doing something about the small number of people who the health system spends a lot of money on and gets really bad results for. We've got, if I can say it, and Drummond doesn't say it quite as bluntly as I will, we've got a hell of a lot of case management on the least expensive part of the system. We case manage the hell out of home care visits, and they cost $80. And we don't case manage the hell out of people who are mentally ill or people who would really benefit from that case management in the same way. So this isn't about getting rid of case management or dismantling the CCC. This is about taking some of the talent we have and putting it where it's most needed. And if we could do that in this reform, will it save $1 billion year one? No, it won't. Will it save a lot of money out over the long term? Yes, it will, because we're going to have more and more people who have complex illnesses. And can we turn this around? I'll give one more very specific example. In my day, the Riverdale Hospital was actually a fairly stale-dated place, is what I'll say about it. It had a length of stay which was largely from the time you got there till you died. It was measured in years. Almost all the patient population didn't have family of any sort, so it became their home. The medical services there were the kindest thing I can say is not very strong. And under some dynamic leadership, and Marion Walsh should get a lot of credit for this, Riverdale has become Bridgepoint, and Bridgepoint is an extremely dynamic place focused on rehabilitation. Lengths of stay are down to months. And a close friend and neighbor of mine, Alan Fotheringham, who went through a life-threatening situation across the street at St. Mike's, when I saw him when he'd first gone to Bridgepoint, I didn't think that, Alan was ever going to recover. Well, Alan since then has written a book, gone on tour, and become just as obnoxious as he was before all of that. I say that in a kind way. But Bridgepoint gave him back his life. And if you'd seen them before Bridgepoint, you wouldn't have bet a nickel that that was possible. So we have to stop giving up on the rehabilitation of people because historically we weren't very good at it. The fact is we are very good at it now. And not only do we have a lot of people walking around with, and this does get attention, with knees and hips that we've replaced and stents in their hearts, the medical miracles, but the rehabilitative sciences have come a long, long way. And if we don't apply those to people, then we're just warehousing them at a big cost for a long time. And we're doing them a disservice, and we're also doing the taxpayer a disservice. So there are some huge opportunities here. And if you haven't taken a stroll and a little tour over to Bridgepoint, I would highly recommend it. And have a look at the other rehabilitative places, and have a look at the whole concept that we can give people back useful life. I mean, if I hear one more time about how much money we spend in the last 6 months of life, well, of course we do. That's when people are sick. It's like saying, so many people are injured on the last run of the day skiing. Now, think about that for a moment. Most people who break their leg don't go back out for another run. I don't know. I would, but other people wouldn't. So there is a tautology about this. It isn't how much we spend, it's what we get for it. And if we just took the mountain of evidence that we have spent 20 years investing in, the intellectual property and knowledge that sits at ISIS, that sits at CIHI, that sits at the Quality Council, sits at the Cancer Quality Council, we know so much more. In the 1990s, when we went through the restructuring, we had very few indicators. We had length of stay. We had, percentage of day versus inpatient surgery. We now have a vast amount of information. And the question is, are we collectively willing to use that evidence to make some really intelligent choices? Because we have to, and I think Drummond is probably right on the arithmetic. We have to find a way to grow the health spend at a third of what it's been growing at. You can get half of that by just saying to everybody, look, you had a great 7 years. Your incomes have gone way up. The next few years are going to be a little tougher. You can find half of it there. We're going to have to find the other half of it by spending the $40 billion in the system smarter and more effectively than we've spent it to date. And the good news is we actually collectively have the knowledge that would let us do that. Thank you very much.
I'd say Michael Decter for minister, wouldn't you? Michael, there was a time when we'd ask you to write that up into an article, but nowadays, with the media that we have, all we need is this video. So if you don't want to write, that's okay. If you do, Diane is upstairs waiting for you.
I see. Okay. Well.
All right. Now, you can go to the mics. There are 4 of them, or if you'd like me to pass one on, I will. Who would like to take the investment manager on first? Talking about the economist, talking about healthcare. Neil, I'm sure you got, no? You're just, oh, here we go.
Thank you. It's Brad Sinclair here. I run one of the operational service agencies. I haven't been on the front pages or anything so far, but that may come. I have a sort of a 2-part question. One, when you think about Drummond, and I think about the kinds of things that you said, Michael, I hear sort of a call to action. And we hear that semi-regularly in healthcare. It's time to sort of take a deep breath and change the way we do things. And then we go back to our offices and try and catch up on the 53 emails and the 46 phone calls, and before you know it, the call to action is just a dim echo. So I guess the first part of the question is it possible to make the kinds of structural changes you're talking about within the existing infrastructure? And if yes, I'd love to know how. The second part, I guess, is it does point to some sort of a new health reform commission or something. Do you think the government has the appetite to sort of revisit yet another health commission, considering that the first one was done under a different government? So first part, can we do it within the existing infrastructure? Secondly, if we can't, do we really need a health commission, and can the government actually deliver on something like that?
The answer I give on the first part of your question is some of it we can do within the existing infrastructure. There's lots of evidence, and I think if everybody here and everybody in management in the system actually just took half an hour at their desk sometime next week and wrote down all the things that they have a role in, maybe not total control over, that could be done better or done differently, and actually started some of those conversations. I think sometimes we're just caught in the inertia of, you know, you go to work and you do the thing you did the day before. And everybody's like that. No one really likes change. But if you sat at your desk and say, is there a better way to do this? What is the evidence? What are others doing? I think there's some part of it. But some part of it is hard to do at that level because we are all inside our boxes. Drummond does recommend another commission. And I have some affection for the idea. The original commission that Duncan Sinclair chaired was not, I think, viewed as a partisan commission. It was viewed more as what the British would call the good and the great. It was largely experts. If you go back to the composition, among the members was Shelley Jameson, who went on to be cabinet secretary in the McGuinty government for quite a long period of time. David Naylor was a key advisor. Mark Rochon was a key advisor. These were, our best thinkers on healthcare at the time. And I always thought that the hospital restructuring, it was noisy, but you know what? There were only really a couple of things that got reversed. Women's did, thankfully, and the Francophone situation in Ottawa, but the vast majority of what that commission did in restructuring terms held up pretty well. And I think in 2020 hindsight, people would say we are better off than we would have been trying to continue the array of hospitals. The second volume they wrote, which was actually on restructuring health services, not hospitals, by the time it landed, I think the government had run out of political will. They'd done hard things. They didn't have any more appetite, so it just sat there. And I think we could do far worse than pick that up, give it another, look from a data point of view, do that quickly. Like, I think speed is necessary here. I don't think you can constitute a group and say, we want to report in 2 years or 3 years. I don't agree with Drummond's time frame on the commission, but I think it would be a good idea, and candidly, if it had a bit of overlap with the old commission, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world either. So I don't know where Shelley is, but she obviously enjoyed the confidence of this government as its cabinet secretary and might be a powerful player in a commission, and there are others who would be very good players. There's some former health ministers I could think of that might have time to.
Michael, on your right, Reza Deber.
So, Reza.
Hi. What I'm wondering is it possible to change the dialogue? Because we've had a history of having save money versus access. More is better, oh, we can't afford it. And yet, every time you get LHINs trying to close down hospitals on the grounds of quality, there's enormous ruckus in the community, how dare you take away our. Is there any way to move from an access versus quality versus cost dialogue to a appropriateness and quality, and the recognition that sometimes more isn't better, sometimes what Cancer Care Ontario has managed to do to improve cancer care, and whether one of the solutions may be to pull specialized services out of the LHINs and do a Cancer Care Ontario type of model.
It's a very good question, Reza. And the easy answer I'd give is I don't know, but we better try. The dialogue, in my view, has some win-lose situations. A LHIN board is going to lose most fights to a hospital board because the hospital board is more legitimate. They're volunteers. They weren't appointed by the government in most cases, and they have more ties to the community, and so the hospital board seems to be the champion of the hospital in the Blue H, and the LHIN comes off seeming like people sent to do the government's dirty work to save money, when in fact the LHIN's motivation may be quality. I think the quality torch has to be carried by clinical leaders. We made progress in the cancer field by having people like Bernie Langer and Andy Smith, who were the leading practitioners in their field, go out and talk to colleagues and show them the data and say, you really don't want to be doing Whipple procedures up here. You really do want to be getting, 15 nodes to the pathologist who should read them rather than 5. Because, so there's a lot of micro changes on quality, and I think we should empower, a significant number of clinical leaders. Some of them may be, no longer working full time. Some of them may be, but we would get more bang out of doing that, when you have, not the authority, but you have the credibility, you have the moral authority, because you can show why, people aren't meeting the quality standard. And I think you need clinical leadership. I grew up, High and all of that thing. If we just had the data, we'd get change. But it turns out who carries the data has huge weight out there. So I could go out and say, the data shows this, and people go, yeah, when was the last time you did a Whipple procedure? But when Bernie Langer goes out there and they go, oh, you're that guy, well, let's take another look at that. So I think that's part of it. And I think we need a more honest dialogue, but don't expect communities to come to public meetings and say, oh, that's great, let's close the hospital. It's obviously a bad thing for us. Because hospitals aren't just about healthcare. They're about jobs, they're about the survival of the community, and often we haven't put up the alternative. So converting, you take all those soldiers' hospitals out there that are a legacy of the returning veterans, have enormous salience. I mean, Sunnybrook managed to convert a veterans hospital into a leading health sciences center, but not true in some other soldiers. Those things, we need to think about what they could become, so that you're dividing, in a sense, the hit to the community. So if they become an ambulatory clinic and they become a nursing home, that's better than just saying, well, we'll close the thing and then later on we'll build a nursing home, or we'll do this. So there has to be a strategy that makes sense to communities, is what I'd say, and an honest dialogue about quality. And sometimes we're just unwilling to say, look, if you drove 40 miles for that procedure, it's going to come out a lot better, because they do a lot of them over there and they only do them occasionally here. But there's lots of politics and all of that. It's one reason we need broader health systems, because if you've got individual hospitals competing, they do compete. And if they're under one management team and one board, they tend to be able to have a different conversation than before.
Michael, it's 9 o'clock and people have to get going, and a lot of them, as you mentioned, probably have expectations of you for where you go next. So I'll just mention that I am from outside of Ontario. In my lifetime, most of this country has looked to Ontario for leadership in a lot of its governance models. That's true in legislation as well as practices. But when you talk about Orange, some of the governance issues don't lead just to criminality. It's intractability that often is the biggest problem. And when you give our company credit, which I do appreciate very much, for some of the models in pre-hospital care, I don't know, and Drummond was kind enough to mention it, it's a good model to follow, but if you look at the situation here in Ontario right now, the province provides, or the Ministry of Health pays 50% of, let's say, ambulance or transfer service costs for the municipalities. The municipalities run them, but they have no clinical responsibility. For their 50%, the province has no clinical expectation. In order to triage people at home, then of course, then there's the dispatch side of it, where you'd really put nurse practitioners, online physicians or whatever to provide this level of care, and that's an entirely different place in the ministry. As a matter of fact, the ambulance services actually relate through the LINs. So to say this is the case, it's going to be very difficult. And sometimes when you look at the situation, you try and approach it, it's as if you have a bomb squad here that's staffed by the most reluctant. I mean, nobody really wants to approach this, it seems. And I think some further level of intervention is probably required, particularly, I know, for people like us to have our maximum effect on the system for this thing to evolve to its next level. Thanks.
Well, the comment I make, I agree entirely, that one of the legacies of the uploading, downloading kind of back and forth is that we've ended up without real accountability or real authority for some things that are part of the healthcare system. So yes, it's a big one to put on the table and say, well, we need to save all this money, but maybe the province should take over provincially the ambulance service and pay the whole shot and rationalize it. If we were just trying to kind of squeeze our way through a 2-year budget shortfall or a 3-year, there wouldn't be political appetite. But if you actually accept Drummond's view, and I do, that Ontario is going to grow more slowly, then those kinds of resorting are going to be really, really important. And somewhere inside, Frances Langton is saying to herself, I told you about paramedics and ambulance a long time ago, and you wouldn't listen to me. And I will say to this crowd, mea culpa, I didn't and I should have, and I continue to learn from you, mostly about how wrong I was about some things. But the fact is, we don't have very many organized out-of-hospital healthcare systems. We've got a quasi-organized home care system, but the ambulance, the paramedic system could be an important piece, but it would have to be brought in to the system, and that might take some reshuffling of funding. But we're not going to solve the problems that face Ontario if we're not willing to look across sectors and look at who does what in a more profound way.
Michael, like the soccer referee, I'm going to add a couple of undetermined minutes. But the last question is from Arlene King.
Yes, hi, thank you for your presentation, and I'd like to just bring the public health perspective to the Drummond report that I think was actually missing. And I just released a report actually at the end of December called Health Not Healthcare, Changing the Conversation. And I, as well as many other people, have noted that 75% of the improvements in health are going to actually come from outside of the health sector. So including things like in ongoing investments in education, housing, the built environment, active transportation, public transportation. And what concerns me is with the ongoing emphasis on health care that we actually may, with the ongoing cuts to all the other government departments that are going to occur as a result of continuing to spend the amount we are on health care, actually worsen our health over time. And I'm just wondering, that perspective I don't think really came out very well within Drummond's report. And I'm just wondering, as a former deputy minister and someone whose interests are somewhat different now, what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you're absolutely right on where the improvements in life expectancy have come from. They've come as the Lalonde report initially said, and as every subsequent report has supported, they've come largely from, better living environment, better sanitation, better education, all of those things. And I think for some populations, particularly the First Nation population, education and housing are far more powerful than spending a lot of money on health care. The difficulty is the public has a vast affection for health care. And they are willing to pay taxes for health care that they're not willing to pay for other things. And that's a tough conversation to have, but it's an essential conversation. So I think that, and there's always this debate, when somebody talks about rolling public health in with part of the healthcare system, that you'll lose the public health idea. I think a good look at Alberta, and there hasn't been a good independent look, but my observation from the regionalization in Alberta, which I was close to, was when public health came into it, they actually had a huge impact on how the total pot was spent. In Edmonton, for sure, not sure whether that was more general. But I think public health has to be at the table in a powerful way when these allocation decisions are made to say, well, wait a minute, if we did that other intervention or we did this. The difficulty for governments is so many of the public health interventions involve spending political capital rather than financial capital. They're really about changing behavior. They're about making things illegal or harder to get, or my daughter spent an educational summer at the Ministry of Health Promotion and had the gambling file, and turns out, you know, that 30% of the revenue from our casinos comes from problem gamblers. And so there's an understandable reluctance to deal too sharply with problem gamblers because they provide a lot of revenue to pay for health care and everything else. So there are some of those dilemmas, but your broad point's important. We should never lose sight of it. We're not going to have a healthier society, community, province, unless we look at what really causes us to be healthy. And so thank you. Good note to end on, if we are in fact ending.
Thank you, Michael. Just some of my own notes. My phone buzzes every time somebody goes on Facebook, so we're out of books. But you know what I'll do? I'll add another 20. So lots of books available. If you're on Facebook and you like us, we'll send you one. On the 21st of March, it'll be Matt Anderson and Doc Danielle Martin at Mount Sinai. Thank you for coming to Breakfast with the Chiefs.